Greetings. Do what thou wilt should be the whole of the law. I'm Lexi Eve, and today I'm going into Chapter 8 of Part 2 of Magick, Liber ABA, Book 4, and this is on the sword. The sword. We spoke a good deal about something very similar in the video about the dagger, but let's see what we could come up with. Before even opening Liber ABA, let me go off the top for a moment. The sword is the spiritual mind of the magician, their Ruach, the intellectual part of the soul. I know Crowley jokes that because the sword is symbolic of the mind, and man prides himself so much upon his intellect, the sword is the largest of the magical weapons. The sword, by appearance, has two edges. This is so very apparent in the sword suit of the tarot. The lower cards, Ace, 2, and 3, are much more positive in readings than the other end of the spectrum of the suit, the 8, 9, and 10. Now, I chose for myself a steel sword with a carbon hilt, for carbon is both Ain and Shin, which is Pan and Spirit, combined with steel, Mars, and that combination just happened to work better for me than the traditional model, which is a steel blade for Mars, bound to a copper hilt for Venus. Thus, the sword that we're going to talk about in this chapter has a polarity of male and female on a lower level than the wand and cup. The sword is ruled by air and breath, and any student who has practiced pranayama thoroughly will be able to make many connections between breath and the mind, especially if they have gone through the meditations of Liber ABA Spiritus. Now, on to the chapter. Quote, "The magic sword is the analytical faculty. Directed against any demon, it attacks his complexity." End quote. Like the wand should be oiled to prevent the wood from rot, and the cup be polished to keep its shine strong, and your thurible be emptied and cleaned of old ash and flakes of half-burned resin, so that it burns what you want it to. Thus you remain control of your passions. The sword should be kept sheathed in a dry place and sharpened regularly on a whetstone to keep away rust, that its blade and its gleam may be as sharp as your mind should be. You must be in control of your magical weapons. You use them, lest they go rogue and they use you. I look at spirits, angels, deities, and the like as personified aspects of the universe, thus objective beings with their own duties, wills, functions, and consciousness, but also as internal subjective aspects of oneself simultaneously. At any time, if you are not in control of all of your being, you could find yourself divided against yourself, with parts of your mind doing other than what is best for yourself. But on lower spirits, the sword is the weapon which directs them because it is the mind, the Ruach, which is connected to the lowest realm, below the feet, where malignant spirits dwell. As I have spoken of in other videos, as angels are responsible for helping humans upwards towards heaven, so are we responsible for lowly spirits. Also, the sword implies division by its function of cutting, and demons must be kept apart from the magician when evoking them. To continue on this subject, quote, "Only the simple can withstand the sword. As we are below the abyss, this weapon is then entirely destructive. It divides Satan against Satan. It is only in the lower forms of magic, the purely human forms, that the sword has become so important a weapon. A dagger should be sufficient. But the mind of man is normally so important to him that the sword is actually the largest of his weapons. Happy is he who can make the dagger suffice." End quote. Yes, as I said in the video about the dagger, yes. As I said in the opening about the metals which make up the sword, Crowley writes that they are steel and copper from Mars and Venus, and, quote, "thus reflect the wand and cup, though in a much lower sense. The hilt is of Venus, for love is the motive of this ruthless analysis. If this were not so, the sword would be a black magical weapon." End quote. According to Crowley, I find the sword plastered on the Tree of Life to be in an interesting position. He says that the pommel is in Doth, and the point downward is in Malkuth. The hilt extends out to Gaborin, Hesed. So much for the sword and stone plunged into the earth. Quote, "Whoso taketh the sword shall perish by the sword," is not a mystical threat, but a mystical promise. It is our own complexity that must be destroyed. End quote. The process of walking the Kabbalistic paths is literally reducing yourself back to zero. I often call it decluster-fucking oneself. The sword is useful within its own sphere, but eventually the wand must be taken up and the sword left behind. The mind and the sword are both of air, and the sword slashing through air is symbolic of such. But I say that to bring up the Aries zodiacal sign person, such as an Aquarius, who plucks thoughts out of the ether. The sword then destroys impure thought. Not the impure thought of the vulgar Christian, no. Thoughts that run counterintuitive to doing your will, working towards that one truth via self-exploration and worldly experimentation. You see, how can you know yourself if you don't attempt to try all things within your sphere of possibility? Now, some things are obviously not to be trifled with, as you know they are harmful, but others, if they interest you even a little, you should experiment. Put yourself in new places, have wild experiences, and see how you react in them. There's a wealth of self-knowledge from such a mentality. I will even quote Crowley on this matter, from this chapter, quote, "On the blade of the magic sword is etched the name AGLA, a notaricon, formed of the initials of the sentence Ate Gebor Leolam Adonai, which is, to thee be the power unto the ages, O my Lord. An acid which eats into the steel should be oil of vitriol. Vitriol is a notaricon of visita interiora terrae rectificando invenies occultum lapidem. That is to say, by investigating everything and bringing it into harmony and proportion, you will find the hidden stone, the same stone of the philosophers of which mention has already been made, which turns all into gold." End quote. As I said, the sword must be transcended and replaced with the wand, for the sword can only destroy, it cannot bind. The process of the Magi is solve et coagula. Hence, the center of the Ruach being the heart, it is seen that this sword of the Ruach must be thrust by the magician into his own heart. Quote, "But there is a subsequent task, of which it is spoken in Liber 7, chapter 5, verse 47, quote, he shall await the sword of the beloved and bare his throat for the stroke." End quote. In the throat is Dath, the throne of the Ruach. Dath is knowledge. This final destruction of knowledge opens the gate of the city of the pyramids. End quote. And another quote, "But this sword is not for the ordinary magician, for this is the sword flaming every way that keeps Eden, and the sword and the wand and the cup are and in the sword the wand and the cup are concealed." End quote. To regain innocence is to regain Eden. In Eden is the head of the serpent of initiation. We come back to the phallus, the poison of Apep as I call it. Death and rebirth, identification with the mother and father in union. Now, if you listen to my video about the cup, I purposely refrain from going into the subject of emotions, for which the cup is notoriously symbolic. That is because it is by the sword that the sense perceptions of the mind which cause emotions are broken up. The magician frees themselves from the trappings of emotions, which are obsessions of the worst kind. How many people are plagued and crippled every day by the overwhelming onslaught of emotions? How many people destroy their lives because of emotions? It is a huge problem, and let's go into that now. Quote, "It was the function of the cup to interpret the perceptions by the tendencies. The sword frees the perceptions from the web of emotion. The perceptions are meaningless in themselves, but the emotions are worse, for they delude their victim into supposing them significant and true. Every emotion is an obsession. The most horrible of blasphemies is a tribute to any emotion to God in the macrocosm, or to the pure soul in the macrocosm." End quote. In Bina, the magician grapples with the Buddhist mystery that existence is suffering. Thankfully, we know now in light of the Book of the Law that there are transcended states beyond the oppressive realm of Saturn, and existence is pure joy. This is not a mere catechism. It is liberty and freedom. To go is the bliss of Ananda. To accept the orbit of one's course as a star is joy. To attempt to swerve is to suffer. You are not expected to start off on the path of the Lima and arrive immediately in this state, but it is a goal and true acid test of where one is at on the tree. When you are doing your will and are in union with New Eden Hadid, a point of consciousness of its position as the center of the universe, and all things happening are pan, that all is permissible, that nothing matters save for the joy of motion and experiencing the bliss of the stars. There is no mind left to chatter away behind your ear and speak the trappings of the discomfort of the gross body. The demon has then been slayed, and there is no bearing upon you. They say pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. But if the point itself could be moved, it would cease to be itself, for position is the only attribute of the point. Let me further quote. The magician must therefore make himself absolutely free in this respect. It is the constant practice of demons to attempt to terrify, to shock, to disgust, to allure. Against all this, he must oppose the steel of the sword. If he has got rid the ego idea, this task will be comparatively easy. Unless he has done so, it will be almost impossible. So says the Dhammapada, "Me he abused, and me he beat. He robbed me, he insulted me. In whom such thoughts find harborage, hatred will never cease to be." And this hatred is the thought which inhibits the love whose apotheosis is samadhi. If you are the point of space that never moves, you are the Tao. There can then be no difference between any one thing and any other thing. All is the same regardless of what is happening around you. Every experience is the joy of the union of Nuit and Hadith. Now, for the beginner, being in this state of, let's just call it impure thought or an unperfected self, here's the solution to the mind and the trappings of the mind that's given in this chapter. Quote, "Let then the student practice observation of those things which normally would cause him emotion, and let him, having written a careful description of what he sees, check it by the aid of some person familiar with such sights. In reading emotional books, such as are inflicted on children, let him always endeavor to see the event from the standpoint opposite to that of the author. Having sympathized sufficiently with both the lions and the Christians, let him open his eyes to that which his sympathy had masked hitherto, and the picture is abominably conceived, abominably composed, abominably drawn, and abominably colored, as it is pretty sure to be. Let him further study those masters in science or in art, who have observed with minds untinctured by emotion. Let him learn to detect idealizations, to criticize and correct them. Let him understand the falsehood of Raphael, of Watteau, of Leighton, of Bouguereau. Let him appreciate the truthfulness of John, of Rembrandt, of Taine, of O'Connor. Similar studies in literature and philosophy will lead to similar results, but do not let him neglect the analysis of his own emotions, for until these are overcome, he will be incapable of judging others. This analysis may be carried out in various ways. One is the materialistic way. For example, if oppressed by a nightmare, let him explain this nightmare is a cerebral congestion. The strict way of doing this by meditation is Mahasati Padhana, which I mentioned in my previous video on the cup. But it should be aided in every moment of life by endeavoring to estimate occurrences at their true value. Their relativity, in particular, must be carefully considered." End quote. So objectivity is the key here. Now, think about this. When you read about a tragedy, let's say 10 die in a plane crash, does it affect you? No, it's impersonal. But you hear this, your mother died in a plane crash this morning. Ah, that's something altogether different now, isn't it? Begin by seeing events as objective and impersonal, no matter how emotionally charged they would normally be. Learn to overcome them that way. See them as not happening to you. They're just things happening. Try to get to a point where you could just see it as they are merely Nuit and Hadith in motion. Then one day you may come to see the joke of Pan. In this chapter, there's more about the intellect, and I thoroughly suggest you read it through, but for myself, this video is at an end. He also goes into the idea of ethics and how that's another trapping of the intellect, especially when it comes to generalized ethics. I personally believe you need to come to terms with what is morally and ethically sound for yourself. You can't really project what's good for you onto another person. One person's happiness might be another person's poison. I spoke about that in the last chapter too. So I'm ending here. Love is the law, love under will. Cheers.